Alright, we should be live for our next chat here on the channel. Welcome everybody, as we're going to be having another discussion about game design. And joining me is a frequent guest and fan of the site, and he's currently working on the game Epic Tavern. Please welcome back Tomo Moriwaki. How are you doing?
Good. I'm happy to be here. Hello, everybody.
It's great to have you back on. We're in the midst of preparing for our next roundtable discussion, which we're hoping going to be able to do next week. But it's always great to have these chats about design.
I agree.
And we picked a very interesting one for today. We're going to be talking about open world design. This is one that we can certainly come back to, especially some of the latest rounds of games that have just been released. Ghost of Tsushima, there's of course a big announcement of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Watch Dogs, Legion. It's a genre that has certainly, I think, exploded in the AAA space, because it seems like it's one of those genres that you really need that AAA budget to go all out on, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's kind of like the baby version of the MMO. Kind of the minimum amount of work to make it make sense gets in the way of smaller budgets and smaller teams. Now, that's not to say some have done that to some extent, right? But then they have to figure out a way to cut out a huge amount of, well, especially for most of your typical open world games, massive amount of 3D environment art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the space itself, I think, has been one of the biggest things about the genre. I mean, it's not a game, it's not something where you can just walk from one end of the map to the other in like a minute or two. These games have just massive sprawl, and that takes a lot of time to develop, and especially for a lot of them, like, we're not talking about games that make use of procedural generation. You are, hand making every corner of that game space.
Yeah, and inevitably in these open world games, and it's not 100% necessary, but it definitely seemed like it was playing out this way at first, where you need some extraordinary mode of locomotion through the space, something interesting and something much faster, which allows you to kind of create this kind of streaming world where I can use the interesting movement capabilities to get someplace, and then I stop using those. Then I hang out there for a moment, doing like some bubble of gameplay, and then zooming off to another space. Like if you couldn't fast travel in Skyrim, but you could get on a dragon or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that said, Skyrim is one of the classic great open world games.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about open world design, I think one thing that I wanted to ask you about and ask the chat in terms of how you would define it. Would you consider games such as the Souls-likes, that the world is technically open, but you are still moving through kind of like these levels? Would that be considered open world to you, or do you consider more of the structure of the entire space is open and you are free, pick a direction and run in it?
So, I mean, I would say for public discourse, it's probably important to say that the Souls games are not open world. And, ultimately, we can kind of choose how we define things. But in terms of kind of, Grand Theft Auto, Streets of LA, Spider-Man 2, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Red Dead Redemption 1, those Watch Dogs, these games where it's open world because you are free to find whatever gameplay wherever it can be, right? It's open to your choices, and that's not entirely the case in the Souls-like games, right? You can run the track forward and back, and you can reset your position and move around the space maybe to some extent, but you can't. Everything is kind of a set piece, and the kind of, it's interesting. I guess you could still call it open world if it was like a left, right, forward, back, open space with little encounters. But the levels aren't built that way necessarily either. And so I'd say that a Souls-like kind of like, at least on the surface, clearly falls short of an open world description. but definitely has some elements that start to become
Yeah.
open world like. And I think maybe that's another way of thinking about it too, is that open world as a genre, think of it as kind of like, what is a particular game's score for its open world genre? And if it scores high enough, we would generally include it in that genre, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I would agree with you. I think one of the major points about good open world design, and something you brought up a minute ago, is that the movement or the transversal options have to be really solid for these games to work, because they're typically, there's so much, I think, like dead time in between the exciting moments that you need to have something else to keep the player's attention. And for me, I think that's always been one of the limiting factors of a lot of the open world genre. And we're going to have to spend a few minutes just talking specifically about Ubisoft style, probably in a few minutes. But like some of my favorite examples would be stuff like Sunset Overdrive, Spider-Man 2, Hulk Ultimate Destruction, Just Cause, where there's, I think, a lot more conscious thought on the movement and the motion compared to something where essentially you're just pressing forward, you hit X, and your character just like automatically walks to their next destination.
Yeah, I think, so for those of you who don't know, I was creative director on the Spider-Man 2 project in 2004, and that is the Spider-Man game that where we went from kind of like level loads to streaming open world. And having been there kind of to make that decision, and to be fair, I would say the best reason why we made that decision was because we were young and we were ambitious and we didn't think enough about it. But that said, our excuses at the time why we went that route, first of all, after our kind of research on the topic, and really at that point, the only research on the topic was really GTA 3 is pretty much, the central thing you'll be studying in the context of open world in like 2002, let's say. And of course, it's a huge deal, right? It's taken the entire console industry by storm. And then they somehow end up being the biggest game of their release 5 times in a row. But that aside, that locomotion thing became pretty critical. That's, I think, in our minds, that's what pushed us over the line. And then once that pushed us over the line, then we signed up for all the hard parts. So this idea that Spider-Man as a character, and we had worked on the Spider-Man 1 game, so we were kind of acquainted with his capabilities from a locomotion standpoint, and really did a lot of development work kind of considering kind of his locomotion powers, which, by the way, for the most part, are extremely annoying from a developer standpoint. He can crawl everywhere. He can kind of fly. It's like you can't make spaces for Spider-Man. It's a huge pain in the ass. What you need is a city. And when we didn't have in Spider-Man 1, but then in Spider-Man 2, we're like, oh, not only do we have a valid, can we check the box of a special mode of travel, it's super cool. So, we would like say stupid stuff like, well, GTA driving sucks, so this is going to be better. I mean, we always say terrible things in the midst of our designs because we get caught up in our own heads thinking that what we're doing is awesome. In hindsight, it turns out that it's inevitably a mixed bag. But yeah, that locomotion and the gameplay enjoyment of the time spent moving from place to place in our minds became the most powerful argument in favor of going towards open world, and it solved another problem. It means that we didn't have to constantly create weird reasons why you couldn't go places in the other levels we were going to build. So welcome to open world Spider-Man 2 at that point.
Yeah. And again, that's one of the major points about open world design, is that it's never designed, or you're not limiting the player on a level by level basis, because we all remember the days of games with invisible walls, or there's that amazing thing in the background, but no, you can't go there because that's not part of the level. In the open world genre, is pretty much, other than like for like story considerations or something like with Crackdown, we have to explore area 1, 2, and 3. It is largely giving the player that freedom.
Well, that said, if you're going to make an open world game, you still have to puzzle over and stress
Hmm.
like crazy on what the boundaries of the world are.
Yep.
And it's more annoying than a normal level, because if it's a normal loaded in level back from like the early 2000s, people can tell, and they bump into walls all the time, so it doesn't bother them that much, right? But the moment you feel like you're free to go anywhere, now if you run into a weird
Hmm.
boundary, you notice, right? And you can probably recall experiences in recent times where you hit a boundary that was not elegantly put in place, and you're like,
Hmm.
yeah, it sucks.
Hmm. And it also makes it a lot more interesting in terms of mission design, which I definitely want to talk about next. But I want to stay on movement and just kind of like the general moment-to-moment gameplay for a few more minutes, because I
Yeah.
think this is something that we've definitely seen an evolution, I think, in terms of open world design over the last 10, 15 years. With, games like the rise of the Grand Theft Auto series, Red Dead Redemption, of course, the big names, Assassin's Creed, Marvel Spider-Man, Just Cause. And it's very challenging, I think, and a lot of this, I think, will kind of wrap around to each other. It's very challenging to give the player all these crazy powers and then say, okay, how do we build a game around this besides just swinging, flying, driving a car, riding a horse, or grapple hooking around the environment?
Well, the thought process for the developers, at least at first, we're not stressing about that at all, because we know what we're making.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to make a game where you run around. In Spider-Man's case, kind of at least before Spider-Man 2, you're going to run around and you're going to beat up bad guys. And then we're going to have important characters in the Spider-Man universe say stuff to you. And then you're going to come up eventually upon a bigger bad guy, and then you're going to beat that bad guy up. And we're going to theme it with webs, because it's Spider-Man. So with open world, what it does is it opens up this entire section of gameplay, which is just like purely locomotion in its concept. Like the idea of like random challenges that are scattered throughout the city that explore the skillful use of the locomotion controls. Very few games were like that. I mean, the racing genre is fundamentally all about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but for the most part, what we were making, we knew what we were making. We were making the same four games that everyone was making.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we chose open world, then we added motion. We added more exploration. Like before, back in the good old days, exploration was just like I read a great article about it somewhere. There are two ways to go, and one of them's a dead end. And
Mm-hmm.
that one with the dead end has a power up.
Of course.
That was exploration back in the day. But once you go to open world, you
Mm-hmm.
really can explore, and now it becomes much more like a World of Warcraft's kind of very high level of kind of theme park decoration and theme park staging skills. Suddenly they're really meaningful, like that, going from south to north in, what was the region called that was in the north, and it had like sick trees, something like Deadwood or something. Whatever. That was a long time ago. But like, just walking through those spaces feels good. It starts telling a story. And all those ideas around how you make just being in the space interesting start totally ratcheting up in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, as you're saying, like that 3D space was such a game changer, not only for the open world genre, but really for just game design in general. I think Grand Theft Auto 3 or one of the Grand Theft Autos was in my 20 essential games to study book because of the fact that that was that kind of watershed moment for 3D based games and for open world design. That was that game that just said you're not just playing it in these little individual areas. Here's a whole fully 3D realized city. Go nuts in it.
Yeah,
And
I think I think it had to have been GTA 3, and I think it's one of the most important games ever made.
yeah.
Continue, sorry.
And what I was going to say is like a lot of people tend to just stop at Grand Theft Auto 3 being violent and the celebrity status, but it really was that game that gave us that open world structure that pretty much everyone's been in some way, shape, or form copying ever since.
When you know why it got that reputation, because I think it makes a lot of sense. Let's say you're about to make the first open world game, but you've never had to do something like this before.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're creating this gameplay that you're intending people to repeat quite possibly endlessly and for to no end. So what do? You emotionally pack that activity with either hilariousness,
Mm-hmm.
like running people over, I guess, and like kind of simple gimmicky things that you can do, like interactivity for interactivity's sake.
Mm-hmm.
But then when that becomes the case, then you need to figure out a way to kind of emotionally charge it. So, hiring a hooker in your car and then running her over and taking money is a conversation topic that kind of, it didn't end. It never ended, right?
No.
That joke, that was a funny joke for years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's why, to be fair, the Grand Theft Auto guys were making that game already, but maybe that's also can be seen as something that contributed to that decision. That whatever they're prototyping and whatever they're gonna like demo out, that it kind of makes sense to them from a feeling standpoint. So they're like, we think that this game can work, and boy, did it work.
Mm-hmm. Now I think like bringing up Grand Theft Auto and again like keeping with this discussion about kind of the movement or just the moment-to-moment gameplay, open world games I think tend to have a very interesting challenge when it comes to their moment-to-moment compared to other games. Like we brought up the Souls-like genre earlier. Like the Souls-likes are really great at that moment-to-moment gameplay because that is the focal point. You are focusing on whatever it is that enemy in front of you, that boss who's about to come charging at you. But open world games tend to have to balance, moment to moment with that greater sense of movement and motion. And I think this has always been one of the things that always drives me a little nutty about these games, where like raise your hand if you ever play open world game where you're just trying to move a little bit forward, you're just trying to touch something, and your character does like a giant dive, or he does some grand motion that just takes you completely away from what you were targeting.
I mean, to be fair, I might just criticize the controls at that point of the game, but that's definitely happened. I think that any game, regardless of its genre, stands to benefit when the designers have a strong grasp on what the player is going to be going through from second to second throughout that experience. But one of the things that immediately becomes more of a challenge once it becomes open world is that things are going to potentially be separated by far distances, right? And in some games like maybe Skyrim, they're just going to let you teleport after you've done it once. But a lot of the other games start to rely on that locomotion mechanic. If it's the car in GTA 3, maybe it's just that you're in an armored suit, because to some extent you could say that the levels and like the areas in Destiny are kind of open world in their design. But like in many of the kind of hybrid open world type stuff, like I guess Destiny and Borderlands being the classic similar to each other examples, you get a car. You get this. A tool was added so that you can move around, and that tool isn't often awesome. I would say GTA driving is a great example that we need people to move fast, but we need them to move fast. More than we need for them to enjoy it a great deal. And to be fair, over the course of many games, the driving has gotten better. But in that first game, I mean, shooting might be another one to think about too. Is what features were added into the open world game to fill some of the gaps in the experience. And were they done just to fill the time, in which case the feature will be underdeveloped and maybe very genuinely smart and intelligently underdeveloped. Let's say Grand Theft Auto's driving and shooting, for example, two control experiences which maybe leave a lot to be desired. And they spent way more energy and effort into making them good, and it removed other options from the game. That may have been a terrible call. Instead, they have absolutely miserable shooting and very, very, very sloppy, simplistic driving, which may have been perfect, right? That they're cheating the larger game experience with a strategy of making the whole experience as good as possible without getting caught up on another GTA criticism, caught up on whether that jump animation is cool enough or not. The freaking double knee jump over and over and over again.
I'm remembering it now after you just said that.
Oh man.
So Here's a question. Explain about like movement and stuff like that. This is a question for you as well as for the chat. What did you think of the growth of Saints Row? And if you remember, like Saints Row 1 and 2 were kind of your typical GTA again. Driving, walking, shooting were your primary gameplay loops. Saints Row the third and then into the fourth game just basically said, we're basically just turning on cheat mode, and that's going to be how you play this game. You get super jump. You just stop short of just, I think, infinite flight in Saints Row 4. And I think that was when I started to feel that issue when it comes to the moment to moment in a open world game, that it felt like I was given too much control in those games, that the entire world just didn't really matter to me at that point.
Well, I mean, I think you're exposing kind of a universal issue in game development or just game design in general, where if it's a matter of the available dynamic range in the experience. So if I can go from 1 to 1,000 in the game, if you give me 1,000 right at the beginning, I will never appreciate 1. And in a lot of ways, if you don't design the game to require the use of 1 and the use of 1,000 in separate situations, then whatever part of the game's experience you don't require will be a part of the game that players don't care about at all. And so I think that just from like at the kind of raw basics of game design, if you have something in your game that you can do, but it is not kind of appropriately challenged or or you're never forced to go through it and actually experience that, which might be the case of like, trying to navigate the streets of a city with a regular car before you get the ability to fly. You will never get the chance to appreciate that driving experience for exactly that reason. And yeah, I think the Saints Row decisions, there's kind of two sides of it. One, by allowing it to be crazy, it's awesome, and it's crazy, and it's hilarious, and that's good. But maybe by not creating enough organized experience to make you earn that power, it cheapened it to some extent.
And I think that's a really solid point. It's kind of like the antithesis of Saints Row would be something like the first Crackdown, where in Crackdown you have to build your skills up. You can't just super jump 80 feet in the air. I think you start with like a normal jump, and then of course you pick up the agility orbs, and then things slowly but surely grow from there.
And I mean, it's tough because I think, different people or different types of players are going to have different ideas about what they like or don't like. So any player that's willing to put the time in and go from being kind of weak to stronger, that strength is more glorious. Yeah. There's going to be something cool about that experience. But for players that don't have the time to get there, they don't even get to know what that's like for that game, right? And then the game that kind of allows them to jump straight in and go kind of nuts, they're going to have a much better time with. So it's kind of tricky. I think that it's always a problem trying to analyze what kind of players you have and how to make them all happy.
Yeah. And I think, like, speaking about, like, movement, like I said, like, if I were to, like, narrow down, like, my top 5 in terms of movement or motion in an open world game, I would say Spider-Man 2, Just Cause, I think I would put Mad Max in there as well.
Ooh, the driving one, yeah.
Yeah.
That was like a weird sleeper.
Yeah. Sunset Overdrive. And, like, again, there's so many. I would kind of say Breath of the Wild in a sense, but it felt a little bit more like Breath of the Wild, it's such an outlier, I think, in terms of its open world design. Like, it's the only one that I can think of that it felt emergent in terms of how Nintendo designed it, and that's not something that I normally say about open world games.
Oh, for sure, yeah, and weird like Sims like stuff, right? With like a sleeping giant and like alternate ways to deal with it and stuff. It's Breath of the Wild is special. Yeah, in fact, the funny way I'd like to counter your statement is, who knows if that was something good or not, that 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 Breath of the Wild is good with movement,
Hmm.
because it's hard to tell because
Yeah.
everything's so damn good. It makes you think everything's good.
Yeah. And I think right there is a really good summation of open world design. It's always about being greater than the sum of its parts. Because if you just focus on one distinct gameplay loop, it doesn't there's usually not enough there to justify a 60 to 80 hour long experience. But when you
Yeah.
combine them all, it it can really keep somebody motivated. And I want to stay on Mad Max. I also want to talk a little bit about Prototype and Hulk Ultimate Destruction, because I think those would be like, if I had to push my list to like 6 or 7, they would be on there. Mad Max, like as you said, like that really felt like a dark horse game. Like it just kind of came and then it disappeared from like the public zeitgeist. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about being able to appreciate 1 to 1,000, because it's very much a car PG. I don't know if anyone described it that way, but they may have. That it's very
Yeah.
much that game where, yes, your character is growing, but so is, the search for the mystical V8 engine and being able to put that into your car.
Yeah, like it takes deadly serious some of the stuff that like Borderlands likes to joke around with.
Hmm.
And I mean, I didn't play it a ton, but it's not. It's definitely the type of game that makes you earn it too. And so I think it was also maybe in a time frame when there must have been a lot of other good games out and a lot of time sinks out there, so
Hmm.
people might have prioritized it towards the back of a list or something. But because I played it like years later, and I was very very impressed, and I was like, how did I miss this?
Hmm. You miss it for the same reason I probably miss games. We have like 30, 50 games we have to play at any given time.
Are you sure yours isn't in the hundreds?
Yeah, I'm trying to tune it out as best I can, but no.
Because mine is in the hundreds.
Yeah.
Mine is in the hundreds.
Hmm.
You know, it's interesting. Of those games, you mentioned Spider-Man 2, and of course, there's a lot I can say about Spider-Man
Hmm.
2, but uh, just for just trying to come in short of dominating the whole conversation with Spider-Man 2 related stuff. I think in our case, our concept of locomotion and movement
Hmm.
ended up like kind of it was different from the other games. I feel like in a lot of ways because our extraordinary movement was the focal point of the game rather than something that was added to
Hmm.
forgive the size of its world.
Yeah.
In fact, for us, in so many ways, we were trying to figure out how we could have a bigger world just because Spider-Man's potential for movement would fill so much space. And for us, then open world design became a solution rather than a problem. To be
Yeah.
fair, the moment we took on the solution in quotes of an open world, we bought into tons of problems.
Mm.
And I think one of our future bits of discussion in this talk should be about the schedule of the way you guide player activity on a schedule
Oh
in an open world.
yes. Oh yeah, definitely. If somebody mark that down, we forget, because I don't even know how long this talk's going to be. And I think what you just said there about Spider-Man 2 is, I think, kind of keys into the point about why those games worked so well for me. Is that the movement, as you said, wasn't a byproduct of the game. It was a focal point that the game was then developed around. And I think you can really see that in some of the better, or at least in my opinion, some of the better examples of open world design. Stuff like Marvel Spider-Man, uh, Crackdown, Hulk Ultimate Destruction, what was it? Prototype being another one. That it there's more to the movement than just going from point A to point B. And I think when that occurs and the game is built around that, that it feels like a much grander experience. And like going back to Sunset Overdrive that I just finished the other night, that's another case where you can tell that they came up with the whole movement tech before they even thought of drawing up that city, because the entire city is built around, okay, we're going to let you grind on, any line that you can see, it's probably grindable. And okay, how do we let the players have fun going from one edge of the map to the other edge, doing all this crazy movement?
It's interesting that you bring up Prototype and Hulk Ultimate Destruction. The creative director on that project is a guy named Eric Holmes, and we're at least sort of friends. And I'm certain we have just very much the same mentality about making games. And if you look at if you look at Prototype and Spider-Man 2, that they're very much the strong analogies for each other at the very least.
Yep. And it is such a that kind of move. I guess, like, speaking about movement tech, one game we should probably spend at least a few minutes on is, of course, Just Cause. Like,
Oh, yeah, man.
Just Cause, just like again,
Well,
like
they did to movement the same thing that Saints Row
yeah.
did to the other stuff.
Oh, yeah, and again, like, it's that case of, like, the first game was like, okay, here's a little map, or it's gonna be a bigger space. You're not gonna be able to do too much in it. And then Just Cause 2 is like, here's an infinite parachute and the world's greatest grapple hook. Go blow stuff up.
They're like, we're sick of having any constraints whatsoever.
hmm
Or actually, though, typically when people like make games like that, they actually don't realize they're as crazy as they are. So they're just like, "Oh, we're just gonna make it. We're just gonna make it a little. We're just gonna add a little bit more flexibility to the player decision matrix here. We really think that, we just think it'll be a little bit more fun." And then they have infinite parachute.
hmm And just like, I think my favorite thing was, like, the solution just is pretty much like any situation, was just crash a plane or just bring a tank in, and that was
Yeah.
it. Bad guys in the way, just grab a helicopter and just ride the Valkyries across the whole area.
Yeah, I love it when I see that in game design, because I think that, you know, there's a certain kind of there is something that you get from kind of wacky craziness that you kind of can't get anywhere else.
hmm
And so, I mean, I say this because the us pack of designers at Treyarch, we all had this this word. We like calling things mega, and mega just meant insane, and it was just our little jargon, or our little inside word for, have we pushed it far enough? Have you gone crazy enough? And of course, there are going to be people that push it more, and I don't know. I'm a big fan. I like it when there's good, solid madness.
hmm And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to talk about in terms of movement before moving on. We mentioned, of course, Spider-Man. I guess anything on your side?
Well, so I mean, I think it's not 100% related to open world gameplay, right? If we just start thinking about like racing games aside, and maybe games like Pilot Wings, you don't see a lot of Olympics games for the Olympics, or Olympic style games are in this vein, right? There's a style or there's a skill
hmm
to controls and navigating, and you can do better or worse. What were games that kind of did this? Were like Mirror's Edge
mm
is an example of this, right? But even Mirror's Edge tried to just have like a much more of a movement footprint, because it still tried to hold on to some of its shooting. If a game was purely parkour, that's what this would be all about in a lot of ways. And I think it's in this early 2000s, kind of the tail end of the Xbox and
hmm
PS2 era, that we start seeing some more of these games starting to come up. And the idea of a movement control or locomotion control
hmm
focus game, I think almost started there, or at least as a did games like Ninja Gaiden / Devil May Cry /
hmm
Bayonetta, like
hmm
those games caught that bug And because they always wanted it, right? In
Mm-hmm.
fact, they kind of were trying to express that even back in 8-bit era. Is they were thinking those kinds of thoughts. In fact, that might be the way to think about it, right? The history of movement actually comes from kind of the pre 3D era and kind of came back in the.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about like movement and motion last night, and I think you kind of froze there. Are you there, Tomo?
I am. Can you see me? Did anything
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah, you're back. You were kind of like frozen for a minute.
Oh yeah, I see it.
What I was saying was, I was thinking about like movement and motion the other night. I think that could probably be a design cast all on its own, or at least a topic, just
Very
on
much agree.
that kind of importance. Because it is something, as you said, like a lot of people don't necessarily think about movement as a primary mechanic. It's simply there to get the player to the other stuff: shooting, jumping, driving, whatever. And like speaking about games that kind of made movement part of its thing, would you consider the 3D Mario games an example of that?
Oh yeah, I definitely think that. And what's interesting is when you were mentioning that, I kind of started to realize like that, or think about what the next step was after the early 2000s. And I mean, take games like Super Meat Boy and kind of
Mm-hmm.
the entire concept of indie platformer, right? And we start seeing a lot of movement focus, a lot of rhythm and timing in the controls.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that definitely, like, I think that rhythm and timing was, except for when to pull the trigger, was lost a little bit in the kind of the beginning of PS2 and the beginning of the Xbox era, right? This kind of like
Mm-hmm.
huge increase in the number of console titles and everything becoming first person shooter or third person action and adventure. There's something like there was a brief period where movement and timing was lost and then it kind of was recovered. Mario, I mean, it's like all things though. Nintendo, kind of wrote the book on so many different parts of what game design is all about, and
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of annoying actually.
Yeah. Again, I think Chris made there someone comment on the video saying like basically the perfect strategy is just be like Nintendo. That's how you do good game design. Just be like Nintendo. It just solves everything.
Well, one thing I think a lot of us were responding to, and maybe the whole idea of open world in general, might be kind of a response to some of Nintendo's fixed play experience design aesthetics that were at the beginning, right? Where it's kind of Mario-esque or Ghouls and Ghosts-esque, where it's the what you're gonna do this over and over again until you get it right, and and it's fun and interesting, and so you'll practice until you kind of like code in like up left, jump jump, up left, jump jump, like this whole string of commands that you'll kind of memorize. And one of the problems with that is that the long-term experience of playing those kinds of games don't ever feel like you get to express yourself. You're constantly trying to match what's necessary and then forevermore do that well. And so kind of breaking that deadlock on the play experience, I think open world is at least one of a number of answers to introduce player agency and expression into just the choices they're making from moment to moment in a game.
And speaking about like kind of like a focus on movement, I think one game that didn't, I don't know if it really got as much credit as it should have, would have been Skate. And kind of
Oh
being
yeah.
like that was that game that was basically we are going to just razor focus on manipulating the skateboard, and that's our entire premise.
Skate was great. Um, yeah, that also brings up games like Jet Set Radio, or
Mm-hmm.
what was it called originally?
Jet Grind Radio.
Yeah. The Japanese games and how their names are different from one region to another, and how how an entire franchise can be thought of as a different name by some depending on where they got the game first.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like there is a spiritual sequel to Skate. I think it's Session that's on early access right now. So I know somebody was doing I think they did a Kickstarter for something along those lines.
I had a buddy who was making a skate game, and it did. I think they had to fold at some point, but they had a lot of the right ideas.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. Anything else for movement? We talked about Breath of the Wild, Grand Theft Auto. I
I mean,
think,
Assassin's Creed.
yeah. I was just thinking about them. Like Assassin's Creed, like that was again like one of those games that it tried to I think do a little bit more in terms of movement with the whole paper doll control scheme.
Yeah.
I don't know. It didn't really I think click for me as much as some of the other examples we mentioned.
Well, I feel like also just the Ubisoft way is their minimum level of polish in the way things have to look. It kind of makes it hard, right? How can you possibly create 100 hours of using Assassin's Creed movement if everything's got to be looking extra nice? And it's like I can only imagine because the number of shortcuts we took just frankly insane. And if we didn't take them all, there was no way we're shipping that game.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Assassin's Creed, like that level of detail, like these games take like 2 to 3 years to make on minimum, just because they have to recreate Greece or ancient Egypt or anything like that.
Totally. To be fair, they're the ones I think they're the only company on Earth that can handle a team with like 1,000+ people. I don't. It doesn't even entirely make sense. That's so many people.
I actually just saw one other point about movement I want to bring up. Like I was saying earlier about how open world games tend to be in the realm of the AAA. That when I see like indie developers try to do like big open spaces, it always feels like the movement is the weakest point. Like I just tried this game called East Shade, which is kind of like an open world. You're going around this island painting, and you're like an artist.
Oh,
And
nice. Okay.
the very first thing I found was that the movement was just like your stock, generic, walking simulator kind of design. And I think for me, and again, like this could just be like my own opinion or my own like preference of open world design, is that I need to be thinking as I'm moving along. Like if I try to play open world game that is just okay, turn your brain off while you wait for your character to get to the next point of interest, I just lose that interest in playing it.
Well, I can definitely say that the cost in development of making all the locomotion related stuff.
I think Tomo froze again.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Can you hear? Okay. I think the cost of developing this kind of open world locomotion and a world that's built to the right specifications to handle it, it's very expensive. And like Spider-Man 2 had something like 5,800 Spider-Man animations. That's just the one main character. And the amount of work that we put into tuning up and figuring out the shape of the world that was necessary to support those movements was a great deal of time and effort. Although it's kind of a fun story about prototyping. I was basically just using cubes in 3D Studio Max and building shapes out of basically collision blocks, primitives, and testing out, swinging around till we figured out what felt good, or the things, mostly figured out a lot of things that didn't feel good. But the animations and registering them to the world, like the Assassin's Creed stuff in particular, is extremely costly on a kind of per second of experience basis. And then trying to take the next step so that you're gonna give like this epic team of artists would amount to hundreds, if not thousands, of kind of like tolerances and specifications that need to be adhered to so that the world works with that controller. That's can be just very, very difficult and both costly in time, costly in iteration, and difficult to plan because of its relationship both to the artists who are artists, the artists who are animators, the artists who are tech artists, the designers, the coders
Yeah.
that need to string them all together, and whatever logistical planning for people and schedule and whatever creative leadership is necessary to get everyone on the same page. It's a big pain.
Yeah. Before we move on, I guess here's a quick question for you. Again, like when we talk about defining the open world genre, we brought up MMOs earlier. Would you consider MMO design to be open world, or would you consider that to still be? It is still like, at least from my point of view, still kind of soft lock behind character progression. Like you can't really go everywhere because if you're level 2 and you walk into a level 50 zone, the enemies will just sneeze on you and you're going to die.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different. I think that you can say generally that many MMOs, I guess, score high on the MMO checklist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of them, it's fair. It's fair to say that they're open world, but a lot of them aren't either, right? Especially like if you take the idea of like World of Warcraft has these spaces where I'm free to explore, but at the beginning, if you take vanilla World of Warcraft, the open world nature of it is only in that I can conduct combat anywhere I want to, minus level constraints.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could farm XP and kind of practice hitting buttons. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It might have sounded sarcastic, but so I think that it would have generally been not really much of an open world game, especially because, well, I mean, the involvement of all the other players, especially in the case of the first World of Warcraft, also meant that there really wasn't a lot of persistent changes occurring in your space. It was kind of a static space that had to stay the same for everybody. By the time we get to today with respect to World of Warcraft, the amount of features that are there to kind of craft your experience is insane compared to vanilla. But let me feel like Warhammer Online again. Like there's like it is open world in nature that I can go to a spot in this zone on this continent, and something might start, and then I can kind of by participating volunteer to be involved. That's very open world in its vibe, right? But that ends up being the minority of the kinds of things you would do in your typical MMO.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'd say 50-50.
All right. I think before we move on, one other game about movement that we haven't talked about, I haven't had a chance to play this yet, will of course be something like Death Stranding. And a lot of people talked about how much of a focus there is on moving from point A to point B. Did you have a chance to play that one?
No, I saw some videos, but my best impression actually is that or my best guess from what I've seen is that it really is a game that tries to get the player to think and tries to get the player to change their default perspective, and that walking forces you to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think kind of like at the philosophical experiential level, that it's a really pointed effort at pulling you out of your expectations.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say?
Yeah, it seemed like it was just going to be focusing on, again, that very simple gameplay loop. I do want to check it out at some point, just to kind of see where things go. I just don't know if I have 50 hours to watch cutscenes.
I mean, we're in the Let's Play world now, though. Watching those videos here and there is a way to kind of catch up on certain games without having to pump the same amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm running into that problem all the time. I need to kind of like sort which games are like really you need to play to kind of code it into your experience, and others where maybe watching is going to be good enough. And maybe sometimes it's the particular person playing just actually speaks to some of the details in a way that make it work out better to view rather than play. I mean, I definitely don't have any. I mean, I used to kind of have a negative attitude about when games weren't played by people, but we just don't have that luxury anymore. You know, even if you had infinite time, you can't catch up.
Nope, definitely not. I think with that, we are, as a quick time check, we are just about at an hour. We never did set a time scale for this chat. I guess. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. I think maybe half hour to 45 minutes more time.
Okay.
The 1.5 hours is usually good for me,
Okay.
Um, and then I'm only allowed to stay away from work related stuff for a certain amount of time. Then.
And I got some work I get done too as well. All right. So I think with that, let's talk a little bit more about mission and kind of the structure of the game in an open world space. Because again, like we could spend another hour just on locomotion alone when it comes to just game design in general. So
Yeah.
mission structure is another kind of very weird part when we talk about open world design. And we're not even at the point where we're talking about like collectibles and filling the world with these little cool things to do. We're just trying to figure out how do you design a mission in a space that takes the entirety of your game space. And this, I think, is another aspect where you can kind of see what's the expression I want to use? You can kind of see like the gears like chafing or grinding against each other for some of these open world games where it's an open world, but the second you start a mission, the world disappears. You are locked into maybe like a 2 block radius for that mission. And again, as somebody who has worked on an open world game, this is Evan where I want to go to your expertise. Like, how do you think about mission structure when you have the entire game space open?
Yeah. So if we take an example like in Spider-Man, we just had this open world. You're free to go wherever you want, and you had to go from point A to point B. And obviously, in the time frame that you had available, there might have been a time limit of some sort, or at least a pretend time limit. The idea is that you'd have to swing, and so now your swinging skills will be challenged going from one point to another. If we think of that as just like an atomic piece and disassemble that for all of its features that have to be measured, let's say, like what part of the play experience is it challenging? And we would have missions that are all fighting oriented, but there's also this, and you'd want to take all of the mechanics you have at your disposal, and if you can, have some of your content focus on a particular part and other focus on other parts, and all of the combinations that can exist leading all the way up to everything combined. At least you'd want to be thinking through that exercise to go, can we create content that kind of checks off the boxes of has one type of control feature involved. It has 2, has 3, has all. Let's say if you had 4, and then has 1 and 3, has 2 and 4, and 4 and 1, and you almost like create like this periodic table of elements. So now you're kind of, and the reason why you're going through this exercise is because you don't have enough gameplay to cover all the time. You never will, because you're okay with them playing forever. And if you could get them to enjoy themselves forever, you would definitely do that, because it would provide so much value that now that you're in a good place with your consumer or audience at that point. Now, but the practical reality is, for hundreds of hours, very few control experiences can cover hundreds of hours. In fact, a control experience by itself obviously can't, because without the challenge, there's no progress to the repetition. Now, you can also introduce role-playing game-like features, like leveling up and getting more powerful and unlocking stuff. That's another totally valid, and we see it all the time. So we think about the mission structure, you kind of need to do that first exercise, because now you know all the things you can do. And by the way, you create the periodic table of elements, like the separation of all these, like a mathematical dissection of what can be done, but annoyingly hardly any of them actually end up being valid gameplay experiences. So tons of them just don't get expressed. I wish I had a good example right off the tip of my tongue. I know there's a couple in Spider-Man, but it's not coming to mind right now. So now once you've created that periodic table of elements and you've identified the things that you could make experience around. Then you got to sort them for how much effort it takes, or how many new features have to go into the game to support those types of experiences. And then, of course, obviously, you start with the ones that have the right relationship of enables the most content, and doesn't break the bank in terms of how much resources it takes to accomplish. And this is another thing that makes your general open world experience out of scope for all but the larger budgets.
Yeah.
Because this stuff is complicated and painful. Go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say, and that is also probably why, for a lot of like Uplays games and a lot more open world games, they tend to focus on 4 or 5 different activities that are then going to be stretched or spread throughout the entire world. So climbing the towers, turning on a base, doing something like that, and we're just going to repeat that. Because again, as you said, like if you had infinite money, you could come up with infinite content, but it's just that difficult to do.
I think what you just described there, also it's worth noting, right, that the reasons why you're doing something is just as painful an exploration or exercise as the mechanical one. We're like, in the context of our narrative, what are things that you can do? I think Shadows of Mordor is a good one. Right, that there are these things that wrap around the orcs and their structure of leadership, and then generalizing who the leaders are with the Nemesis system. By the way, Shadow of Mordor is an amazing game. Whatever that it's ahead of its time. Like they started that whole thought, right, and now the rest of us keep thinking it. But where was I going with that? There's just part of the reason why when going through that periodic table of elements exercise is hard is because a ton of things that you could even imagine making work somehow just make no sense, right? It's like, we wanted to combine our wall running with our alchemical mixing features, and it just doesn't seem to make sense in our game about spaceship captains.
And
go ahead.
The Nemesis system from Shadow of War, I mean, that is a fascinating design, and it's something that I think we need to have a discussion about that just singularly at some point, just in terms of like that kind of impact on the gameplay. And it actually, I think, is a good lead into who said it? Mr. Elroot said this earlier about waiting for the next evolution of open world design and having more of an impact on that open world, because that I think has always been one of the limiting factors. And I think obviously from a budgetary standpoint, an open world game that's the size of Assassin's Creed game where the player has complete sculpting capabilities, I don't even want to imagine what that budget's going to be. And I think that's always been one of the limitations of the open world design, is that you can only interact with the stuff that the game explicitly tells you can interact with. So, a city in Just Cause, you can rain 50 missiles down on it. It won't show anything. But that one red barrel, you can shoot with a pistol, it explodes in a Michael Bay explosion.
Exactly, yeah. It's tricky. I mean, there have been some games that have explored procedural destruction of environments, right? And that's some interesting stuff. It's just right now it's so much, you can make it look so much cooler if you do all the work, and the big game companies are like, we'll spend the millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And not only that, we'd spend millions of dollars if we could guarantee good procedural destruction, but we have no idea because no one's done it necessarily 100% yet.
The closest would
that's why you need the crazies.
Yeah, the closest would be something like a Red Faction Guerrilla. I think they're the ones. Yeah. They're, I think, the last ones to do procedural destruction like that.
And that thread came to a close, basically. So we're not going to see much progress on that anytime soon. Maybe something weird with Google Stadia might make that a possibility. This kind of access to lots of processing, but somehow live within their limitations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's in. I mean, those kinds of ideas change things. Those ideas, when they become a reality, that opens things up for open world games in a way. Like, I mean, I remember there's a game I think that's kind of like Minecraft, but set in World War One trench warfare, where you build stuff too. I think by Jagex. Um, that's a great idea. And if you could have a world where we're like driving tanks around and blowing things up, and it's like deforming the world around me, and I can do something like an artillery strike in an area and then run up and take cover in the craters, that's super cool. But the rest of it's got to be cool too then.
Yeah. So basically, we want Breath of the Wild meets Red Faction. That's going to be the dream. That's going to be the next open world design right there. Somebody make that for us right now.
Yeah, back when I didn't think about like resource limitations, I was trying to imagine what it'd be like to have like an armored battle suit fight kind of like multiplayer combat game experience where you're doing stuff like smashing through walls and destroying buildings, and kind of having that kind of like an Appleseed or Ghost in the Shell fight from those awesome cartoons, animes.
Mm-hmm. And I guess bringing this back to like the mission structure, I think this has always been one thing where like the Grand Theft Auto series in particular has kind of faltered on, because they are so story driven. It means that the missions must play out without. I think there's very little player agency in the Grand Theft Auto missions. I think one of my favorite or more infamous examples was I think from GTA 4, where you're supposed to kill somebody, you're chasing them down, and you're shooting the car, you're shooting them. They won't take any damage because you haven't reached the proper trigger, the proper event in the mission before they're allowed to take damage.
Yeah, and those kinds of gimmicky things, especially when you find the limits, feel kind of cheap. But it's worth noting it's the right call on their part. You make the custom missions cheaper, and that makes that because you need to set aside a lot of development bandwidth for all the procedural stuff.
Yeah.
It's all like 100 times more expensive, and so if you can have a kind of a cheap way to make your story content, especially because let's say you like many of us, you can't imagine like creating a game where the main story could be procedural. It just isn't really inside of our imagination quite yet, and so you'll have to have something there, something to kind of guide the larger beats. But if you spend a lot on it, like as much as like Naughty Dog does, for example, then you have no bandwidth for your open world feature set, and your open world feature set is extremely expensive, and not less expensive. Like the overall budgets aren't less expensive than what Naughty Dog does, although they sure put a lot of money into stuff like true mocap performance, and a lot more money into maybe set design and the kind of detail of a lot of their environment stuff, because it is what it is. But the trade-offs are psycho. They're horrifying, and then looking at a GTA 3 custom mission might be the perfect way to see that difference.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we've seen in terms of mission structure, just the overall structure of the open world genre, has been that kind of RPG progression. And this has been something that I think Far Cry was the one that kind of popularized it, or specifically I think Far Cry 3 was the one. I think Far Cry 2 was still very much like there wasn't too much in terms of like the abstraction. But 3 really did set that blueprint for you're going to unlock all the players' abilities, and they're going to have to do random stuff to unlock double jump or the ability to stab somebody in the back. And I think this goes back to what we were saying in the first part about starting at 1 and working your way up to 1,000. But I think part of the issue, and I want to get your thought as well as a chat on this, is that these games always end up going in the same way. That if I do those bonus kind of side missions, I become death incarnate, and the entire mission structure falls apart. Like the boss is like, you can't defeat me. Oh yeah, I have my fully upgraded dual pistols that also explode, and I have full infinite regenerating shield, I'm not losing this fight.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, I can tell you why we have that side content,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is that in the open world, we're already kind of forcing players to make choices in how they spend their time.
Yep.
And once they start making their own choices, especially as you go further back in time, this will be more true because us developers don't even really know how to do that in our heads, really. This idea where, well, how do you estimate? Once, let's say we force you to make 50% of your choices, and those 50% of choices we force you to make, you have like, what do we measure it? Like you have like 10 options for those, right? So that's 50% it is overall the game is 5 times more complicated because of the amount of things you can do now. But of course, not everybody's precisely the same. They will make their choices kind of. Some of their choices will be heavily modified by who they are and what they like. And so we made these options available, but not everybody takes advantage of them. And actually, some people are really crazy and they don't even care about the main story, and all they do is want to play this. So
Mm-hmm.
we need to have a valid progression experience where they just start skipping out on the story.
Mm-hmm.
And you run into that Skyrim problem, right? Where if I don't have like truly dynamic difficulty, and of course there's a problem in Skyrim because I can just push past that limit, and then in
Mm-hmm.
which case I'll be overpowered anyways. Um, that the main story can really suffer. Things can get really out of sync or out of balance, and then you run in. Some players will have very broken experiences as a result.
Yeah, and that's again that issue of balance when it comes to an open world game. What you were saying earlier, in terms of how do you guide the player around. That if you have somebody who just does the story, is it theoretically possible for them to beat the game? Because if they, let's say you, a side quest unlocks bonus healing, or the side quests are the only ways to raise your health total, can somebody who doesn't do all that actually beat the game? And for a lot of these open world games, it's not, they say you don't need it, but, under their breath, it's like, yeah, you need to do this or you're not going to have a fun time.
Yeah, it's tricky. I don't know what the right answer there is, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like if you're gonna make an open game and you're selling it as an open world game, I think it's okay that some amount of freedom of exploration, some amount of time spent with the player not knowing where to go next and or not being given information about where to go next is okay. It's less okay if my ability to freely walk around and do stuff isn't cool, right? And it's not like people check a box and say I'm going to make an open world game and suddenly all these things become a reality, right? That there's all these pieces of the puzzle we're talking about. I'm free to actually make them all however I want to. It's just that most of the choices I would make if I made them randomly would end up messing things up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, something to bring up I think that was really important for us in Spider-Man 2 is it's not just all the things that can be done, that periodic table of elements I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, you also have to break it up into time scales. What is your second by second? Well, this is a universal truth about game design in general. What is your second by second gameplay? What is your minute by minute gameplay?
Mm-hmm.
What is your 10-minute by 10-minute
Yeah.
gameplay? What's your hour by hour? Do you have day by day? Do you have month by month? And once you start breaking your experience up into those, and what you need to do, by the way, is you need to be considering what are the player's goals in those time frames.
Yep.
And then now they can embark on those goals. And if something will take a month, I need to know what I'm going to get at the end of that month. And obviously, if something's going to take a second, you kind of know what you're going to get. You're going to get a hit or a miss, kind of, in the grand
Mm-hmm.
scheme of things.
And to Mr. Elwood's comment, chat about like sandbox and open world design, like would you consider sandbox games to be similar to open world, or are there different elements to them?
Well, I mean, they are words, and we have a lot of power over how we want to interpret them. But the way I would approach it is, sandbox is a characteristic of a game. And so the sandbox wouldn't be genre so much, because genre requires some specific things to come together and there be like a series of games that share those similarities. the vast majority of open world games are strong in their sandbox nature, right? And what I mean by that is that there are systems at play in the world, and I can engage with them however I want to, and I might get more or less success or failure. I mean, some of these systems aren't even going to have, though, the concept of success or failure, right? There's just behavior, responsiveness, and feedback that occurs in your space. Um, you know, Sandbox for Spider-Man 2 is that the buildings have different shapes, and there are flagpoles and light posts and various things that your webs can stick to, and they'll all create kind of different systemic results based on the openness of our system of travel or of locomotion. If our system of locomotion didn't have that nuance, then the world couldn't be a sandbox for those actions. And so if we kind of like, at least to get to my definition of it, is that there's a general system of interaction and then a general system of behavior, and they work together procedurally, and they work the same everywhere in that world. And now you're free to play around with it. And if we did our jobs right, that sandbox element that's been added to the game is something interesting, and there's a bit of a mystery for you to unravel as you figure out how it works.
Mm-hmm. So to a Worm's question, ultimate. So the ultimate open world game is 100% sandbox. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say. I mean, I don't. It just depends on what it is you're looking for. Mm-hmm. I think for a lot of people, the ultimate open world game actually is mostly custom, with just for whatever is the perfect amount for them to make them believe that the world is open. Because now that custom cool thing happened in this world where I imagine almost anything could happen, right? And now it feels so much richer an experience because my specific cool stuff happened in a world where lots of random things could happen, even if that's not exactly true. I mean, for myself personally, I do very much like closer to 100% sandbox.
So here is a question for you and for Chad as well, with regard to like mission structure or content in an open world space. Do you think should the player be rewarded in a meaningful way for all the content that they can do in it? And what I mean by that is that we've seen some open world games in terms of their bonus or their side content, they will either give the player some new powerful upgrade, some new reward, or they'll just give them like generic experience or money, which eventually that stuff it will no longer be applicable.
I mean, you should reward behavior that you want to see players do. But it is true in the course of extremely long hours played games that their economies often break down. I mean, Oblivion and Skyrim are great examples of just everything breaking down by the end of it, and you're still kind of okay with that though. So is that a problem? It's kind of hard to know. Like their philosophy would be, we're going to keep rewarding you even though the rewards will lose value because we can't possibly know exactly how everyone's going to play, and we have to tune the overall experience to meet the needs of our median player. And turns out that most of you hardcore players can min-max the daylights out of this system, so you're going to have broken the economy, after like 50, 70 hours. Yeah. And then to be fair, after 50 or 70 hours, I did continue to play the game for another 150 hours, however. So they didn't do anything wrong in that regard. But more generically or universally, I do think that you want to... how should I best describe that? Okay. You want the player to feel good or positive as a result of doing things you want them to feel good or positive to the degree that you want to promote behaviors. And so if something you want the player to do a lot of X, then you want to incentivize X. However, there is no better incentive to do a thing than for it to be intrinsically enjoyable. And so it's not like in the context of Spider-Man swinging, we don't reward it much. But that's because we don't have to. There's something fun and interesting about it, and that's its own reward. And that it can support a lot of in-depth exploration. Great. That's this huge, like we've packed the rewards into the intrinsic structure of the activity. And it's always better, just period. It's always better if you can convince someone to do something because it's just enjoyable.
Yeah.
Now, however, that's much easier said than done. The vast majority of the things that you have players do have pretty short shelf lives. It's like a lot of I don't know. Okay, I got too snagged on trying to come up with an analogy, but let's see, something that everybody will know. It's like, hey, okay, so remember in Street Fighter, is it Street Fighter 2 Alpha, when Ken got that big, low roundhouse kick? And I don't know if everyone felt that way, but I felt like that felt so good that I wanted to do that all the time. And it was so much cooler than Ryu's heavy kick. Now, using that attack has some intrinsic value, and there's a reward for it. But it's worth noting its intrinsic value was greater than its effectiveness. And so I started overusing it just because it was cool. And so I guess that the point I'm just trying to make is, as a designer, you want to know how much you incentivize every activity or every action in the game. And to be fair, generally speaking, you don't have to worry about toning down the reward unless it's like I just gave too much gold for doing something stupid, in which case you could just give less gold, right? For spreadsheet adjustments, you always want to get as accurate as possible. But if something feels good, usually it's not a problem. But it's still worth thinking about. If you're not thinking about where the rewards for a given action should fit in alongside all the other things that players can do, you're letting randomness take over, and you're going to get random results. I guess that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that with regards to, like, for myself, for a lot of the open world games that feature all kinds of like bonus challenges, race across the map, do something in 2 minutes, kill as many enemies as you want, that I just don't find myself gravitating towards those challenges because they feel like they're constraining, the general play of, what I'm doing in the game normally.
I mean, depending on the game, a lot of these more modern games, I feel like they don't even try to create intrinsic value to the actions. The whole game is like hard coded and carefully balanced according to spreadsheets, so that everything they want you to do is valued and incentivized and rewarded precisely as much as it should be.
It feels very much like that hand-holdedness. Oh, here's the thing that really drives me crazy. When you have a reward structure where you test the player, collect 5 boar pelts, destroy 6 bases, anything like that, but you can only do those quests in a specific order. So if, let's say you collect 6 boar pelts, but you did it before you collected the 6 rabbit pelts, then you don't get any reward for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like maybe if you switch that around, the developers make use of accomplishing multiple objectives in line with each other, or kind of like interlaced with each other. That's cool. That's good stuff, and that is superior, right, to the kind of serial objective accomplishing.
Yeah.
And it is one of the things that open world offers, right? That I could do many things all together. In fact, this made me think of Destiny, actually. So, like, like in the context of Destiny 2, there are all these bounties, where you have to accomplish X, Y, or Z, shoot people with this type of gun, kill these kinds of enemies, complete this kind of activity. And you just scoop up like a shovel load of these bounties, and then you just kind of look at them and you go like, well, this one and this one and this one fit together, and I can do all three of those while doing this activity, and if I get that and that, I can be making a little bit of progress on those as well. Oh, and there's this quest, or this, I don't even know what I'm trying to explain here. The things that aren't square, they look more like banners that you have to accomplish. I'll make a little bit of progress on this other thing too. When that happens in your head, I think that's super cool at that point, right? Because now I'm using the incentives as a way for you to dig deep into the structure of the game's activities and construct like a daily plan to accomplish lots of goals, right? And it's very satisfying for our brains, and it also gets you to think really deeply about what you can do in the game. That's all really good stuff.
And I think very importantly, it makes the player be in control over what they're going to do on any given time. And it's like the same thing that we see from a lot of like strategy or kind of like systems heavy games where you're just trying to figure out, okay, if I do X, I'll be rewarded with Y. But if I get rewarded with Y, I can then use that for task Z. And if I do Z, it lets me do this. And then, 10 hours later, we're still plotting this whole thing out in our heads.
In that, that is a bit of the trick, right? Is that I guess at least in the context of Destiny, right? That is just very much an action game. If you're not going to feel perfect, although maybe this didn't bother me, but to spend, like, you're doing it to optimize your time, right? But if you spend too much time doing the optimizing, then you spend more time in total. That said, optimizing itself can be fun, right? That's what a lot of puzzle games, or a lot of games in general, they're about creating efficiency. And when you like creating efficiency in a game over the actual activity in a game, when you don't mind taking the time to do it. Right? Yep. The moment you're like, oh, that's going to take too long, I'm just going to do whatever, the activity is more, I guess, more intrinsically rewarding.
And I think to Splendid's point about what we're really seeking playing these games, I think this is where I think the open world genre and like MMOs kind of intersect with kind of the motivation, because there are people who will play these games just for the missions or just for the story. There are those who just want to literally wander around these amazing game spaces, like we saw with Assassin's Creed with the what's the name of that mode? Museum mode or museum tour mode, whatever they called it. And
yeah, I read a little bit about that.
And then there are people who want to play these games, for 100% completion, which I don't think I will ever have the time to do it any one of these games.
Well, I actually think of it as an industry-wide error of sorts. Actually, that we found the completionist mentality was so clear and visible to us that we overdid it a little bit. And that we sometimes make our game a bit too much for the completionist, and also, so I think we also a little bit misinterpret the completionist. Completionist doesn't like taking forever; they like completing things.
Yeah.
So if you let them complete it quicker, they might be happier, but not so in console. In console, like, I think it's now the last of the mobile and console are both spaces where you'll see games being created to intentionally take a lot more time. And they're not, I don't think it's necessarily the right call. I don't think they do it in a way that means they get more money in the end. It's not just a money grab. It's they're trying to do their best for users, and they're more frightened of not taking enough time than they are of making sure that time is spent as well as possible.
Yeah. And I think this again goes back to a discussion we've had earlier on the channel about, motivating somebody to complete a task. That it's better to have 10 collection quests collecting 10 things versus one collection quest of collecting 100 things. Because the player needs to feel, there has to be, and I think it came up earlier in chat, there has to be that carrot on the stick for doing any one of these tasks. And I remember with Assassin's Creed 2, and they have you collect those feathers. That was collect just 200 feathers. I'm like, No, I don't want to do this. I don't care about how much my younger brother really wants those feathers. I'm not doing that for the next 20 hours.
When the numbers get really big, it's interesting because then it'll transform into a different kind of experience. Like collect something that'll take hours. Generally, right? You would design that in a way that the player would never do that in a single session.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of that transforms into long-term tracking. But like to have to collect 30, like if it was like early World of Warcraft quest and you had to collect 70 of a thing, people would get kind of sick of that, and that they collect 9 or 7, and that somehow it's like we're just like dissecting human psychology, that if every single like wolf pup you killed dropped a pelt and you had to get 7 of them, it's so predictable that that's not that cool an experience. Mm-hmm. Now, if roughly every other one drops one, now you feel good when it does drop, and you feel a little bit of a when it doesn't. But that doesn't happen that often. That makes it a little more interesting because now you have in a weird sort of way, you have a little bit at stake the moment the wolf dies, right? Am I going to get that pelt? But the overall time it takes should still be the same. So you probably want to cut in half the amount of pelts you got to collect so it doesn't feel upsetting, right? This is all like kind of like player experience math that we constantly got to be running to try to get the best results.
And I just thought like the perfect exploitation version would be like collect 100 wolf pelts and there's only a 25% chance it'll drop after each kill.
Yeah, and if you started to do that and you thought that you're going to be here till you're done, you're like, no, I quit. I'm out. Bye. Mm-hmm. And you're probably not very happy.
Yeah. I think what you said there about allowing the player, like, not, like, if you're going to start a task, the player kind of needs to know, how long, or a good idea of what it's going to take. Like, you don't want to give the player a task that's going to take, 30 days of playing your game. And, it just becomes a very repetitive mess like that. Like, it seems like I think going back to the completionist example, that if you're going to start something, you should be able to, I think, do it within, like, the same stretch of playing the game. And I think that's something that a lot of open world games tend to forget on, or tend to avoid, is that they'll set up, you have to, climb up 50 towers in this game, and it's going to take you the entire play to get this one thing checked off your list.
Yeah, and you're seeing some developers are getting better about this kind of stuff, right? Where even if it was like a long task, it's broken up into pieces, mm-hmm. and they at least even just alerting you that you made progress. Like sometimes, like think about how sucky it is. Like if you had to collect 100 of a thing, but it doesn't really effectively tell you when you get one of them. Mm. So like you've been killing wolves for a while, and then you realize that you only got one, and you're like, that's weird. And then you start questioning, like, did I get any in this area? Am I in the wrong area?
Oh yeah, that's the fun
part.
part.
Waste the last 25 minutes, and those thoughts, man, they mess players up. That's just that kind of stuff is so important to avoid.
Oh, that's the bonus point. Like, you have to collect wolf pelts, but you have to specifically collect the gray wolf pelts. If you kill the brown or black wolves, they don't count.
Totally. And then for whatever reason also, the king of the wolves doesn't count either.
Oh yeah, the hardest wolf in the game. No, he doesn't count for this quest.
And when everything, I mean, to be fair, a lot of it is when everything makes sense, it just works better, right? Like that somehow the king of the wolves drops 2 pelts, and all of them have, maybe some of them have a lower % chance, but that somehow it all fits together. It's not, I mean, it works as in the kind of World of Warcraft logic. It works to have that circle on your mini-map to say, you got to do it in here, or else you're not in the right area. But it's not ideal, right? Ideal would be that I don't have to think about it. I don't need to look at a bunch of weird interface, that it just worked, and I was playing the game and having a good time. Yeah. To be fair, some games are sort of about this kind of puzzling over stuff, and that's okay too, but not a lot of them. A lot of them, they end up getting kind of snagged, and I mean, I've made a bunch of choices in my life that snag players on puzzling over what it is they should be doing and whether they're doing it right. And I think it's a problem space that'll always be there.
Mm-hmm. As a quick time check, I know we are just hitting an hour and a half right now, so I guess
Yeah, maybe we
anything.
should start wrapping it up a little bit, and I'll get on to my other responsibilities, I guess.
Yeah, we do definitely need to do a discussion just on locomotion and movement at some point. I think that would be a very fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and if we do that, maybe we could just start it off and I'll like kind of talk through some of the details of how we got the Spider-Man swinging and locomotion package in general going. It's a pretty interesting story, and I mean,
Mhm.
we had a lot of the right interests to do it, but we weren't those guys at the beginning of that process, and we were definitely those guys at the end of the process. So it's an interesting. I mean, I think I've told bits and pieces of it on various calls, but it's an interesting story in its own right.
All right. So I guess to end this discussion, any final points about open world design? And at some point, we'll have to like pick a game and kind of just like break things down. Focus on that. But anything to kind of end this cast on?
Well, so I think if we wanted to take a big step back and try to look at the big picture, something specific to open world is how well is the how appropriate or effective or good is the overall promise of why you're exploring this world.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that GTA 3 started us off pretty good, where you're just like the story of being a criminal in an open city and being able to cause trouble freely
Mhm.
is a pretty good core promise for the experience, and it worked out great. And you could tell, right? They put a bunch of energy into the escalating law enforcement response to your causing trouble. Um, and hell, that was the game that I played for a lot at the beginning. And then you take Spider-Man, and you're gonna be a superhero, and you're gonna solve petty crimes, and you're gonna swing around this forest of giant buildings with an interesting control experience. Like that was the thing that we were offering. Um, I think if you kind of start as we start making our way, like the Fallout, more recent Fallout stuff, it's that post-apocalyptic world and kind of that Chernobyl or Stalker-esque sort of kind of vibe that got established in what, for whatever reason, Stalker kind of is the definition of wandering around a post-apocalyptic
Mhm.
radiated world. Um, I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but I feel like I saw a lot of the same DNA in some of the more recent Fallout stuff. But
Mhm.
that said, like the big story idea of why you're wandering around and what the context is for you to have that freedom is a really important piece of the puzzle as well.
Yeah. And I think for myself, I think as we've said earlier that for me, like when I think about the open world games that really did excite me, it's when that movement or that motion or that just the general moment to moment, as you said, like the second to second gameplay is at the forefront of the experience. That I and like for my like I did not get into the Bethesda or Fallout games or like the Skyrims because I always felt like they're being built around what you're doing in the next 2 to 3 hours, not what you're doing in the next 2 to 3 seconds. Whereas something like Sunset Overdrive, like I said earlier, it basically I'm thinking about okay, I'm going to grind up to that rail, wall run over here, air dash, bounce, and I'm just constantly in that sense of motion. The same thing for Spider Man, Just Cause, and even to a lesser extent, Mad Max. That,
Prototype as well, huh?
yeah, that it's kind of like when it doesn't do that, it feels like you're putting the cart. Oh, hold on. Oh, voice is dying. It feels like you're putting the cart before the horse, in my opinion.
Well, and also I feel like it depends on kind of where you're coming from, right? Some gamers are fundamentally more action focused, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was definitely like this myself for a long time. Whereas if the game didn't fire effectively on some of the core action controls, it
Mm-hmm.
really hurt the whole game's experience for me. Um, and I can see past that now. But back then, I really had huge problems with GTA's shooting mechanic, and that jump animation. Um, as well as the driving mechanic to some extent. Some one of the titles you just described, I blanked in my head.
Uh,
Um, oh, Skyrim. Yeah, yeah.
mhm,
Skyrim and Oblivion's combat of swinging its sword around is pretty icky,
mhm,
and that I think that can hurt the experience. And then they have to rely on their long term meta experience
mhm.
to keep your satisfaction going. And then, in which case, what's weird is for those developers, by the way, they're just working on mitigating aspects of the second by second game that are problematic. As long as you aren't offended, we're good because our metagame is awesome. And some developers are better at that than others. And some, I mean, to be fair, it's not a ton of developers that are really good at action controls
Mhm.
because for whatever reason, it's shit's hard.
Yeah. And I think again, like that is a really solid point about. I think where your preference or where your focus on progression lies with these games. Do you prefer, moment to moment? Or are you thinking about the story over 10, 20, 30 hours? Or are you thinking about MMO progression over, days or months or years of play? And I think it really lends itself to different audiences as well, and why there is such a, I guess, no pun intended, a wide market or wide spectrum of open world fans.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, I guess what is the biggest audience has got to be. Well, I guess that Spider-Man recent Spider-Man game did really good,
So did
but
Red Dead as well.
Red Dead, I think, probably represents the broadest appeal, right? This
Hmm.
because it's still it's the right balance between the core fantasy of what's going on in the world and still the control experience being acceptable.
All right. I think with that, again, there's still so much we can certainly segue into, but, we always try to do these once a month, so there is always next month's topic. And we do have our roundtable, hopefully, we'll be able to set up for next week. So I think this is a good spot to end things on for right now.
Works
And
for me. Yep.
for the chat, if there are any design topics you want us to cover in a future segment like this, let us know in the comments below. But Tomo, as always, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you this afternoon/evening, and yeah, I'll be looking forward to our next chat.
Absolutely. It was awesome to be here and chat with you about this stuff, and can't wait for the next time, which should be soon with the round table. I
Hmm.
can't. I hotly anticipate what the topics of conversation will be.
And I guess any new updates on Epic Tavern you want to tell the people watching?
Oh yeah, so we have our Discord channel which is a great place to come and visit and have conversations relating to storytelling and game design. We are in the midst of releasing another patch. We're hoping to get out of early access before the end of this year, and I guess that's it. We do our dev streams Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us at twitch.tv/Epic Tavern.
Awesome. All right, everybody, that will do it. So thank you so much for watching this, whether you're enjoying it live or recorded. I'll be back later for our regular game streams and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Have a great rest of your night, and see you next time.
Bye, guys.